All right, how's it going, everyone? So in this video, I'm going to go over repairing this NSG 370 6-speed transmission that's out of a 2018 Jeep Wrangler. The NSG 370 transmission, or NSG series transmission, is a manual transmission that Chrysler uses. It goes in a lot of different vehicles. It's actually a Mercedes-based transmission, and these can be found in some manual Mercedes cars, as well as this Jeep here. So this transmission is unique. It has 6 forward gears, 1 reverse. The issue with this particular transmission is the customer is complaining that when engaging 5th gear, that it kind of grinds and is a little bit rough to get into. While on a test drive, I found that when shifting into 5th gear that it does grind quite a bit and want to pop, which is an indication of a synchronizer blocker ring issue. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this transmission and inspect and possibly repair the 5th gear synchro assembly. Now, 5th gear on this particular transmission is direct drive, so that is locking our input shaft here to our output shaft. So we don't necessarily have speed gears like we would going from 1st through 4th or into 6th. 1st gear on this particular transmission is a low range of 4.46 to 1. 6th gear is or overdrive ratio, and that's 0.64 to 1. So 5th gear is right there at 1 to 1. So more than likely we're going to be replacing our input shaft as well as the synchronizer assembly for 5th gear itself. So what we'll do is we'll start taking this apart. Again, this transmission is a little bit unique. Most rear-wheel drive transmissions, you're going to have a center support bearing plate, and you'll have a bell housing, and you'll have a rear extension housing that has to be removed. This transmission doesn't do that. To tear this down, we will be removing these inverted Torx bolts, plus a couple of the plugs inside of the bell housing, and snap rings on the extension housing. We'll then be using this special tool, which is a jig that supports the main shaft and the counter shaft, as well as the shift fork assembly here. The first step that I have done is I have put the transmission into neutral, so all of our shift forks are all at the same level, and then I've used this little plastic clip from when you replace the shift fork assembly to keep everything locked in. This way I ensure when I pull the cases off I don't have any issues. So other than that, I also have to remove this reverse switch and start taking these inverted Torx off, as well as some seals on there. So we'll get started on that and move forward. So now I'm going to be removing a plug that is used to cover up the retaining bolt for the counter shaft main bearing. I drill a hole and then use a slide hammer to remove the seal safely without gouging the housing. I then have to go through, remove that big large bolt. After that, I remove all the inverted Torx, keeping track of where their position is. Alright, now I have the 2 case halves separated. I've separated the bell housing from the main gear cluster part of the case. So now we can see we have our output shaft and our counter shaft with our different speed gears on it. So 5th gear is this top one right here. So to get this onto the jig, you actually do have to take off the adaptation collar that goes to the input shaft, our roller bearing, and the first blocker ring for 5th gear. Now you can actually start to see some damage. So the brass portion isn't too bad, but where we do have issues is we do have some issues on the engagement hub, and it's kind of difficult to see. I'm hoping the camera can not be super blurry, but these little dog teeth right here all have the ends worn off. Now these dog teeth are going to engage into the blocker ring, so it's going to bring everything in alignment and allow this shift to happen seamlessly. So the synchronizer is synchronizing both the input shaft and the output shaft to allow us to have 5th gear. So this portion is damaged, and this is part of the synchronizer assembly, which we will have to replace, and that will repair our issue with 5th gear engagement. We'll also go through and look at all the other synchronizers, so our 6th gear synchronizers right there, so on and so forth. One of the other areas of damage that I found that I didn't necessarily notice at first was this little plastic bushing right here in the case for this shifter assembly is broken. Now that can also cause it to have a rough engagement into gear. So we're going to replace this, we call it the knee brace, this shifter assembly, and then go through and take apart 5th gear assembly right there. So we'll have to unbolt these these Allen headed screws, and then use a special puller along with removing a snap ring in the back to get this back housing off of the gear cluster. So we'll do that now. With the 4 Allen headed screws removed, I can now remove the shift fork assembly and install the transmission back half onto the gear cluster support jig. I then drill a small hole in the output seal and use a slide hammer to remove it. Then there's a snap ring that has to come out for the case half to be able to be separated from the gear cluster. There's a removal installer tool that it's used. This will prevent the bearing from being damaged on removal. Alright, so now I've separated the output shaft that has 5th gear synchronizer on it from the counter shaft and the jig and everything. So our next step, this is our 5th gear, 6th gear synchronizer. So I have to take out that snap ring, the pair of snap ring pliers. It's just going to expand out and remove the snap ring. I'm trying to do it with one hand, so I'll have to do it. I'm going to put the camera down. We'll have to take this sliding assembly off, and we have to be mindful of the detents that are going to come off with it. After I've taken that snap ring off, the Synchronizer Hub, which has got an interference fit against the output shaft here, has to be pulled off. So we're actually going to have to put a 3-jaw puller and pry up against this collar, and that will allow us to remove the synchronizer assembly. And that's basically as far as we need to go on the overhaul of this transmission. One of the other things that I'm going to be looking for is I'm going to be looking at all of the other synchronizers to make sure none of them are collapsed and that all the teeth are good. So if this is an example of 1st gear down here, and all of the teeth are nice and sharp. Same thing with 2nd gear. It's just 5th gear that we were having that issue with, and that's on the end of this this slider assembly right there. You can see where the dog teeth are all rounded off really bad. We'll also have to go through and replace the input shaft, which is going to require me to take out those T30s, and that will remove 2 collars and the input shaft will come off, because again, 5th gear is direct drive, so it's locking our input shaft to our output shaft. So we'll get to removing the synchronizer assembly and then move on from there. So I have a 3-jaw puller set up. It's going to release the interference fit that this hub has against the input shaft. So we'll just turn this up and remove the hub from the assembly. There we go. There's our 5th gear, 6th gear synchronizer assembly removed from the shaft. Alright, so we have our 5th gear, 6th gear synchro here on the bench. If I start taking the components apart individually one at a time as they're laid out, we can see we have the adapter that goes on to the input shaft, because again, we're locking the input shaft to the output shaft to get 5th gear, because it's a 1-to-1 ratio. That then has this cone that the brass blocker ring will fit onto, and as the slider of the synchronizer slides into place, it locks this brass ring to this adapter and it brings it up to speed with that interference fit that it has, locking the input shaft that we have in our case to our output shaft. And we have a direct drive ratio of 1-to-1, and that then goes out to the output shaft and out to the differential. So the components that we need to look for wear on this is obviously our dog teeth, which this one's okay. But we also need to look at how this materials is riding on this adapter. So normally this would be on the speed gears, but because it's a direct drive, this collar is splined internally to the input shaft. And what we have is we do have a fair amount of wear right there. There also can't be any, there has to be a little bit of clearance between this brass ring and this adapter, and that's for that interference fit that this is going to have a little bit of a cone to. So normally it's about 30 or 40 thousandths of an inch, but it's completely collapsed. The other part that we have a little bit of wear is on these dog teeth. Hopefully that will, you know, it's kind of tough to see because they're very small, but that is on this hub assembly. So if I slide this up, I'm going to pop out all 3 detents. We can get a better idea of the dog teeth are rounded off on that side, but not on the 6th gear side. And a lot of times this happens because 5th gear is crossing the gate when we leave 4th gear and go into 5th. we're shifting, you know, not straight up and down, but we're shifting at an angle, and it can be missed relatively easily. So we have to replace this whole assembly as one. So we're going to be replacing the synchronizer hub. It'll obviously get new detents and new roller bars with it. The 6th gear adapter sleeve with the blocker ring, and then 5th gear. You can get an idea too. There's a bit of an bit of a clearance between 6th gear. This has the right amount of clearance between the adapter and the blocker ring, where 5th gear has none. So other than that, the only other thing we need to replace is going to be our knee brace plus the input shaft in there, because I want to make sure there's no issues with engagement here. So it's really important. We have our new synchronizer assembly with our adapters and our blocker rings. It's really important though to make sure that this gets installed in the right direction. So it's important to pay attention as you're tearing this down. So if we look, there's a really small lip on the top of that slider, and there's not on this side. So looking at our old one, the lip is on the end that 6th gear would be on. 5th gear has no lip. So we need to make sure that we're installing this with the lip down, and then that way we know we're all the way in. Looking at our blocker rings and our adapters, they all share the same part numbers, so they're going to be good. So we'll just have to make sure that we get this collar in on the speed gear as so, and that blocker ring sits in there. Now these little tangs have to correspond with the tangs inside of the synchronizer as well, the hub. This is going to be pressed fit down on, so we need to make sure we're not going to damage these, because these are brass and they're easily damaged. So you want to make sure you line those up before you press it on. Alright, so I've gone through and pressed on the synchronizer hub assembly with the synchronizer slider and 6th gear blocker ring and friction ring installed. One of the things that I've learned over the past, it's a good trick, is you put trans gel or petroleum jelly around the detents for the synchronizer slider. That way they're less likely to pop out. Now it's important to note when installing these, you need to pay attention to the direction that it goes. So if you notice, there's a little bit of a hub or a lifted area in the middle there where the splines are, and it's higher on this end. So on this particular 5th, 6th gear synchronizer hub, the larger end needs to be down, going towards 6th gear, and the shallower end up towards 5th gear. So at this point we're going to put our snap ring back in, and then we can put this shaft back on with the counter shaft, and we can start to reassemble the transmission. I have the gear cluster back on the jig. Our 5th gear synchronizer assembly is down here, and it moves up and down smoothly. I also have all of the other synchronizers for 1st and 2nd, 3rd and 4th, and 5th and 6th in neutral, so that we can install our new shift linkage assembly. So these are all our shift forks. We have all 4 shift forks. We have our clip in it for keeping it in neutral. We have to make sure that these little plastic tabs right inside of the synchronizer sliding hubs, and they have to go in nice and even, and these 3 little lugs right here are going to sit right here. So I'll reinstall that, and then we have to reinstall the back half of the case, which will involve using the special tool. We flip the rod around from being a remover to an installer. So we put the bearing on the other end, and then this tool now becomes an installer and presses the case down. One of the other things to bring up too is, if we look, I haven't cleaned the case off at all, and we can see the sealer is still wet, and that's because these transmission cases use a special type of sealer. They use a sealer that's called Anaerobic Sealer. So this is a sealer that activates or becomes hard and seals with a lack of oxygen. Now the machine surface of both case halves is fine enough to where there will not be any oxygen into it, allowing it around any of the material, and that will then harden up and give us a good sealing force. So until there's a lack of oxygen, it stays wet, which is kind of unique. Now, anaerobic sealer can't be confused with room temperature vulcanizing silicone, which that's what this is, and that's what's a traditional silicone that you'd see on like transmission pans for automatics and engine pans and so on and so forth. The difference is this is for finely machined components, that there will be no irregularities in the surfaces. this will be able to flex and take into some different regularities. And there's different RTV silicones for different fluids and different uses, whether or not the component's aluminum or steel or so on and so forth, or trans fluid or engine oil. So we're gonna have to clean everything up very, very carefully with this so that we don't gouge the machine surface, so that we don't have any potential leaks. So we'll clean this up, and then you apply this very thinly across the entire case for it to seal up. So we'll go through and install the shift linkage, and then install the case and get this transmission back together. So a lot of care needs to be taken when installing this shifter assembly. Most transmissions will have individual shift rods with the shift fork as an individual unit for each synchronizer assembly. In this case, it's not. It's all one modular piece. The problem lies is the little plastic feet that go into the sliders can very easily fall out and get damaged. So take your time when installing components like this. I then use transmission gel or petroleum jelly on all the surfaces that are going to have a bit of an interference fit against the case. That way installing the back half of the case goes a little bit smoother and there's less galling. I'll also have to keep in mind to have the reverse idler mesh into the counter shaft. At this point, the removal tool is now converted to an installation tool, and I am able to press the back half of the housing onto the transmission gear cluster. While I'm doing this, I'm taking my time to make sure that the shifter assembly is also lined up and installing the 4 bolts that retain that. Alright, so I have the top half of the 5th gear synchro blocker ring and engagement collar on, as well as the roller bearing, so they can go into the case. I already torqued down the shift linkage for the shift forks, so this half of the case is ready to go. I put anaerobic sealer around the perimeter of the 2 case halves. This is one of those situations that more is not better. You want to have just enough. Remember that this is only going to activate with a lack of oxygen, so any of this sealer that comes out will stay wet, and also any that goes in will stay wet. So you don't want this big ribbon of junk around the middle of our trans case. One of the things of importance with that, on why you don't want more than that, is on the back half of the case here. This is where the shifter bolts up to, and this little opening right here is for the transmission vent. Any sealed container that's going to have fluid in it needs to be able to vent off any pressure that's built up, and that little area, the vent is really, really small. It's very easily filled in with RTV, or in this case the anaerobic sealer, and clogs the vent, which then will pop out all of the seal. So you'll leak from the input seal in the case and the output seal, as well as the case half. So it's really important that more is not always better. So what I'm going to do now is I will plop this half of the case on, torque it together, and then we'll do the final assembly. The last steps for completing the assembly of this transmission is installing the counter shaft retaining nut and the plug that covers the access to it, and then also replacing the throwout bearing with a new one and lubricating everything for the throwout assembly. Alright, so we've completed final assembly of the transmission. Throwout bearing, all of the electrical, or the only electrical, the reverse switch is installed, everything's sealed up. Now the transmission still doesn't have any fluid in it. It's really important to make sure you use the correct fluid. So we're going to be using the fluid that is based for this transmission. The other thing I like to do before I put it into the vehicle is to bench test them. And to bench test a manual transmission, you shift it through all the gears. So what I've done is I removed the shifter from the vehicle itself, and what I'm going to go through is so there's first, second, third, fourth, fifth, which was our bad one and it's not clunking anymore, sixth, and then reverse. So the transmission goes into every gear. This is a pretty good test to make sure that, you know, we put this in and there's not going to be any issues with it actually not going into gear. So what I'll have to do now is I'll remove the shifter, and we can install this transmission back in the vehicle and give it a road test. So other than that, filling it with fluid, it should be all that we have to do. Some of these you do have to bleed the clutch or adjust the clutch. We were able to take the clutch actuator for the throwout bearing off the side of the case, and we don't wreck the hydraulic system at all. So we should be able to bolt this up, drive it, and call it a day. So I appreciate you all taking the time to watch the video, and I will see you in the next one.